"Mister, your cattle are in my barn." Clara Holt stood on the porch of the Mercer Ranch house with mud caked to her boots and exhaustion settled deep in her bones. 3 days of tracking through snowmelt valleys had left her stiff and hollowed out, but she'd found what she was looking for. Now she just needed to deliver the news and go home. The man who answered the door stared at her like she'd spoken in a foreign tongue. Josiah Mercer was taller than she'd expected, with shoulders broad enough to fill the doorframe and hands rough from decades of ranch work. His dark hair showed threads of gray at the temples, and his eyes, brown, deep-set, tired, held the kind of wariness that came from too many years of bad news arriving at first light. "I'm sorry," he said slowly. "Your barn?" 23 head. JM inside a diamond. That's your brand, isn't it? Drifted into the valley near my place during the storm last week. I've been keeping them fed while I waited for someone to come looking." Behind Josiah, a second figure emerged from the dim interior of the ranch house. This one was older, leaner, with a face weathered to the texture of old leather and eyes that narrowed the moment they landed on Clara.
"Vernon," Josiah said without turning. "This is -E. I know who she is." The foreman's voice carried the flat tone of a man who'd already made up his mind. "Widow Holt. Lives on that 40 acres her father used to run, down past Miller Creek." Clara met his gaze evenly. She'd learned long ago not to flinch from men who thought a woman alone was either a charity case or a threat. "That's right." Vernon stepped closer to Josiah, lowering his voice but not enough to prevent her from hearing. "Widow Holt thinks she's a cattleman now. Found some strays and expects a reward, I'd wager." Clara's jaw tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. She hadn't ridden 7 miles before dawn to argue with a suspicious foreman. She'd done what needed doing, and now she wanted nothing more than to go home, stoke her fire, and sit in her empty cabin until the silence stopped feeling like a punishment.
"No reward necessary," she said, addressing Josiah directly. "Your cattle are healthy and accounted for. You can send your men to collect them whenever it suits you." She turned to leave. "Wait." Josiah's voice stopped her at the edge of the porch. "You tracked 23 head through the storm, by yourself?" "I know these valleys." Clara didn't turn around. "My father ranched this land for 22 years before the drought forced him to sell. I know where cattle go when they're scared and cold. It wasn't difficult." She descended the porch steps and walked toward her mare, Nell, who stood waiting at the hitching post with the patient resignation of a horse who'd learned to expect long days and hard work. Behind her, she heard Vernon mutter something she didn't catch, followed by Josiah's low reply. She was tightening the cinch on her saddle when footsteps crunched across the frost-hardened ground.
"Mrs. Holt." Clara paused, one hand on the saddle horn. Josiah Mercer had followed her into the yard. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes more clearly, not just fatigue, but something deeper. The hollow look of a man going through the motions of living. She recognized it. She saw it every morning in her own mirror. "I'd like to see the cattle myself," he said. "Verify the count, if you don't mind the company." Clara hesitated. The part of her that had learned to guard her solitude wanted to refuse. But there was something in his voice, not suspicion, like his foreman. Something closer to curiosity, and maybe, underneath that, a loneliness that matched her own. "Suit yourself," she said.
The ride to Clara's homestead took nearly 2 hours. They spoke little, the silence between them filled by the creak of saddle leather and the soft percussion of hooves on half-frozen ground. The morning warmed slowly as the sun climbed above the ridge, burning off the last of the frost and revealing the muddy aftermath of the recent storm. Clara's 40 acres came into view as they crested a low rise. It wasn't much to look at, a modest cabin built from salvaged lumber, a barn that had seen better decades, a garden plot fenced against rabbits, and a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the house. Everything was tidy, well-maintained, but there was an emptiness to it that had nothing to do with the land. "You live here alone?" Josiah asked. "For 5 years now." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't press. That was something, at least. The cattle were in the barn, just as she'd said. 23 head of good stock, branded with the JM diamond that marked them as Mercer property. They were calm and fed, having spent the past 3 days eating hay from Clara's winter stores while she waited for their owner to claim them. Josiah walked among them, running a practiced eye over their condition. He checked hooves, examined coats, counted twice to be sure. When he finished, he turned to her with an expression she couldn't quite read.
They're all here, all healthy. He paused. How did you find them? Clara leaned against the barn door, arms crossed over her chest. Same way my father taught me. Cattle follow patterns when they drift. They move downwind in a storm, always toward water and shelter. The creek that runs past my place feeds from the same watershed as your northwest pasture. When the storm hit, they followed the water until they found a spot that felt safe. And you knew that.
My father spent 22 years reading this land. He knew every creek bed, every shelter spot, every place cattle liked to hide when the weather turned mean. Before he died, he passed that knowledge to me. For a moment, her father's voice echoed in her memory, as clear as if he were standing beside her. Cattle follow water, Clara girl. Find the creek, find the herd. The land tells you everything if you know how to listen. She hadn't thought about those words in years. Hadn't needed to, but tracking Josiah's cattle through the snowmelt valleys had brought them back, along with 100 other memories she tried to bury.
My foreman would have spent a week searching for them, Josiah said quietly. Probably would have lost half to predators before he found the rest. Clara shrugged. Your foreman doesn't know this land the way I do. Josiah reached into his coat and withdrew a leather wallet. I'd like to pay you for your trouble. $2 a head. That's $46. It's fair. I don't want your money.
The words came out sharper than she'd intended. Josiah's hand paused, the wallet half open. Mrs. Holt, E.R. I found your cattle because they wandered onto my land. I kept them fed because letting them starve would have been wasteful. There's no debt here, Mr. Mercer. You don't owe me anything. She turned away before he could argue, walking out of the barn and into the thin morning sunlight. Behind her, she heard him close his wallet and follow. The truth was, she didn't entirely understand her own reasons. She'd spent 3 days in the cold and wet, tracking cattle that weren't hers, feeding them hay she'd cut and stored for her own animals. She'd done it without thinking, without questioning, without once asking herself why. And now, standing in her yard with Josiah Mercer looking at her like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve, she still didn't have an answer. Maybe she just needed something to do. Something that mattered. Something that made her feel, for a few brief days, like she wasn't just waiting to die. I should go, she said. You can send your men for the cattle whenever you're ready. I'll make sure they're fed until then. Josiah stood by his horse, reins in hand, but he didn't mount. He was watching her with those tired, hollow eyes, and something in his expression had shifted. Not suspicion anymore, not even curiosity. Recognition. Thank you, he said, for what you did, regardless of whether you want payment. Clara nodded once, turned, and walked into her cabin without looking back. 3 days later, the storm returned. Clara woke to the sound of wind screaming across the ridge and rain hammering against the cabin roof. She'd seen bad weather in her years on the frontier, but this was something different. A late spring storm that had come howling out of the mountains with a fury that felt almost personal. By late afternoon, the rain had turned to sleet, and the temperature had dropped enough to make the world outside her window look like something from a nightmare. Gray sky, gray land, and everywhere the slash of ice falling from a sky that seemed determined to punish anyone foolish enough to live in this God-forsaken territory. Clara sat by her fire and tried not to think about cattle. It was none of her business. Josiah Mercer had men to handle his stock. Vernon and the others she'd seen moving around the ranch property when she delivered her message 3 days ago. They would know what to do in a storm like this. They would handle it. She had her own concerns. her own animals to protect, her own survival to worry about. But as the afternoon darkened toward evening and the storm showed no signs of letting up, she found herself standing at the window, watching the road that led toward Mercer Land. A group of riders passed in the dim light, moving fast toward the northern range. 6 men, hunched against the sleet, heading out to search for cattle that had almost certainly scattered in the storm. Clara knew where those cattle would go, knew it as surely as she knew her own name. She stood at the window for a long moment, her hand pressed against the cold glass. Then she turned, pulled on her oilskin slicker, and walked out into the storm. Nell didn't want to leave the barn. Clara couldn't blame her. The mare was 9 years old, sure-footed and steady, but no horse enjoyed weather like this. Still, she went when Clara asked, picking her way carefully down the muddy road while the sleet bit at their faces and the wind tried to tear them both off the trail. Clara told herself she was just checking her own fence line, just making sure the storm hadn't done damage to her property. It was reasonable, responsible, nothing to do with Josiah Mercer or his cattle. She kept telling herself that as she rode past her own boundary, past the places where her fence needed mending, past the point where any sensible person would have turned back. Box Elder Canyon was 5 miles from her homestead. 5 miles of bad road and worse weather, with the light failing and the temperature dropping and a voice in her head asking what exactly she thought she was doing. But her father's voice was louder. Cattle follow water. Find the creek. Find the herd. The canyon opened before her as she crested the last ridge. In the gray stormlight, she could see them, dark shapes huddled against the canyon walls, pressed together for warmth, flowing with distress but alive. 47 head, maybe more. All of them marked with the JM diamond. Clara dismounted and tied Nell to a scrub pine at the canyon mouth. Then she walked into the herd, moving slowly, speaking softly, doing everything her father had taught her to keep frightened cattle from scattering. The night was going to be long, and cold and miserable. But for the first time in 5 years, Clara Holt felt something other than emptiness. She felt useful. Morning came slowly, gray and grudging, with the storm finally dying to a cold drizzle. Clara had spent the night on her feet, walking the perimeter of the herd, keeping the cattle calm, preventing the kind of panic that could send 47 head scattering across the hills. Her bones ached. Her hands were numb. Her voice was raw from hours of speaking in the low, steady tones that kept cattle settled. But every animal was still there, every single one. As the light strengthened, she began the drive. Alone, using techniques her father had perfected over decades, calling patterns, pressure points, the careful art of moving cattle without pushing them into fear. It was slow work, exhausting work, but it was working. She was 2 miles from Mercer Land when the riders found her.
There were 4 of them, emerging from the mist like ghosts on horseback. Vernon was at their head, his face a mask of disbelief as he took in the sight of Clara Holt, mud-caked, exhausted, and driving 47 head of cattle through the aftermath of the worst storm in 4 years. What in God's name? Dashy O.L. They were in Box Elder Canyon, Clara said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. I found them last night. Kept them contained until the storm passed. Vernon's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at the cattle, looked at her, looked back at the cattle again. The expression on his face might have been comical under different circumstances. You kept 47 head contained in a box canyon overnight? Alone? He shook his head slowly. Ma'am, we lost 40 head in this same storm. We had 6 men out searching. That's not possible. Clara didn't respond. The cattle were there. The count spoke for itself.
More hoofbeats approached, and she turned to see Josiah Mercer riding up from the direction of the ranch house. He pulled his horse to a stop a few feet away, his eyes moving from Clara to the herd to his stunned foreman. Vernon, report. Aye, the foreman swallowed. She found them, sir. All 47. Says she spent the night keeping them calm.
Josiah's gaze returned to Clara. Something passed between them, not words, nothing she could have explained. Just a moment of connection, of recognition, of two people seeing each other clearly for the first time. "You did this," he said. "Not a question. Your cattle needed help. I was able to provide it. In a storm that killed 3 of my men's horses. In temperatures that dropped below freezing. Alone."
Clara's hands tightened on her reins. She was too tired for this conversation, too tired to explain herself, too tired to pretend she didn't understand what he was really asking. Why? "I know these valleys," she said finally, "better than anyone alive. My father taught me, and his father taught him. When the storm hit, I knew where your cattle would go. I knew how to keep them safe, so I did." The silence stretched between them. Around them, the other riders shifted uncomfortably, uncertain what to make of this woman who had done what their entire crew couldn't manage. Finally, Josiah dismounted and walked toward her. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his face, the worry that had kept him up all night searching for cattle she'd already found. "Come back to the ranch house," he said. "Warm up before you ride home. It's the least I can offer." Clara should have refused. She was tired, filthy, and in no mood for company. But something in his voice stopped her, not gratitude exactly, though that was there too. Something that sounded almost like hope. "All right," she said. The Mercer ranch house was larger than Clara had expected. 8 rooms, she guessed, built from hand-hewn timber that had weathered to a soft gray over the decades. Inside, the main room was warm with wood stove heat and furnished with the kind of practical comfort that spoke of a family's life. A large dining table, chairs worn smooth by years of use, bookshelves crowded with volumes that showed signs of being read and reread. But there was an emptiness, too. Clara felt it the moment she stepped through the door. The house had been built for more than one person, designed for a family. Now it echoed with the particular silence of rooms that hadn't been used in years. "My daughter lived here until last September," Josiah said, as if reading her thoughts. "Emily. She married a man from San Francisco, good fellow, works in banking. They moved west after the wedding."
He poured coffee from a pot that sat warming on the stove, handing her a cup without asking if she wanted one. The tin was warm against her frozen fingers, and Clara wrapped both hands around it gratefully. "How long were you alone with her?" she asked. 17 years. Her mother died in childbirth." Josiah's voice was matter-of-fact, the grief so old it had worn smooth. "The second baby didn't survive either. So it was just the 2 of us, from the beginning."
Clara said nothing. She knew the weight of those words, knew what it meant to lose everything and keep living anyway. "First time in 17 years I've been truly alone," Josiah continued. "Took me by surprise. How hard it was. I thought I'd prepared for it. Thought I knew it was coming. But when she actually left..." He trailed off, staring into his own coffee cup. Clara watched him, this man who was essentially a stranger, and felt something shift in her chest. A recognition, a kinship. "It's different than you expect," she said quietly. The silence. Josiah looked up. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "You know," he said, not a question. "My husband died 5 years ago. Fever. My son too. Thomas. He was 3. The words came out before she could stop them. She hadn't spoken her son's name aloud and years hadn't trusted herself to. But something about this moment, this quiet room, this man with his hollow eyes and his understanding silence, something made it possible. "I'm sorry," Josiah said. Clara nodded. She didn't trust herself to say more.
After a long moment, Josiah rose and walked to the wall where several hand-drawn maps hung in simple wooden frames. "These are the survey maps of my property," he said, his voice shifting to something more practical. "Every year we lose cattle to drift. My men search, but they don't know the land, the way. He paused. The way you seem to. Clara set down her coffee cup and crossed to stand beside him. The maps were detailed but incomplete, showing property boundaries and major landmarks without the deeper knowledge that came from living on the land for generations.
Your northwest pasture, she said, pointing to a section of the map. It empties into Miller Creek, which feeds Box Elder Canyon. That's where your cattle went last night. That's where they'll go, every time. How can you be certain? Because cattle are predictable once you understand them. Clara traced the path on the map, her father's knowledge flowing through her fingers. They drift 3 to 4 miles per day in good weather. In a storm like last night, they'll move 8 to 10 miles, but always downwind toward shelter. Your land funnels them naturally toward the canyon. It's not a flaw, it's actually useful, if you know what's happening. She could feel Josiah watching her as she spoke, his attention focused in a way that made her both uncomfortable and strangely pleased. My father kept journals, she continued, tracking patterns, water routes, shelter spots. 22 years of observations. He knew this land better than anyone alive. Before he died, he made sure I knew it too. From the doorway, she heard a quiet footstep. Vernon stood there, arms crossed, his expression no longer openly hostile but still wary. He was listening, she realized, taking in everything she said. I can show you, Clara offered, surprising herself. Mark the maps, explain the patterns. It won't stop the drift, but it will help you find them faster when it happens. Josiah was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. I'd appreciate that. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Clara checked the drift-prone pastures after every weather shift. She reported her findings to Josiah. She helped recover scattered cattle before they could be lost to predators or exposure. She told herself it was neighborly duty, nothing more. But the truth was harder to admit. The truth was that for the first time in 5 years, she had a reason to get up in the morning. Small kindnesses accumulated. Josiah brought her 2 quarts of firewood she hadn't asked for, stacked neatly beside her cabin door. She mended a harness he'd left behind after a visit. 4 hours of careful work with all in wax thread. They sat on her porch in the evenings, drinking coffee and watching the sun sink behind the mountains, speaking little but sharing silence comfortably. Clara began to feel something she'd thought was dead forever. Purpose. Connection. The faint, terrifying stirring of hope. She was at the general store in town, picking up coffee and flour when Mrs. Crawford cornered her near the dry goods counter. Mrs. Holt. The woman's voice carried the particular sweetness of someone about to say something unpleasant. I've been meaning to speak with you. Clara's hands tightened on her basket. Mrs. Crawford.
I've noticed you've been spending quite a bit of time at the Mercer Ranch lately. Riding out there alone, staying for hours at a time. Mrs. Crawford's smile didn't reach her eyes. A widow has to be careful of her reputation, dear. People will talk, and frankly, they already are. The words landed like stones in Clara's stomach. She'd known, of course. She'd known that people would notice, would judge, would draw conclusions that had nothing to do with cattle tracking or neighborly assistance.
I'm helping Mr. Mercer with his livestock, Clara said, her voice carefully neutral. Nothing more. Of course, dear. Of course. Mrs. Crawford's expression suggested she believed no such thing. But you know how it looks. A woman alone, spending time with a man alone. Even if nothing improper is happening, the appearance. Clara set her basket down harder than necessary. Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Crawford. I'll keep it in mind. She paid for her purchases and left without another word. But the damage was done. The old shame had risen in her chest, the fear of being seen as desperate, grasping, improper. She rode to Josiah's ranch less frequently after that. Told herself it was for the best. The spring cattle drive arrived in late April, bringing neighboring ranchers together to pool their herds for the long journey to the railhead. 847 head from 5 different spreads, worth approximately $25,000 at market. all gathered on Mercer land for the count and final preparations. Josiah had asked Clara specifically to attend. Her tracking skills, he said. Her knowledge of the land. He needed her help with the count. She'd almost refused. Mrs. Crawford's words still echoed in her head, and the looks she'd gotten from other women in town hadn't helped. But when she thought about staying home, sitting in her empty cabin while Josiah and his men tried to manage nearly 1,000 head of cattle without her knowledge, she'd gone. The other ranchers noticed her immediately. A woman at a cattle drive was unusual enough. A woman helping with the count was unprecedented. Mercer's got a lady cattleman now. One of the men, a heavy-set rancher named Holbrook, laughed loud enough for everyone to hear. What's next? She'll brand him too? Clara ignored him. She'd learned long ago that engaging with men like Holbrook only made things worse. The count proceeded smoothly until it didn't. 3 hours in, the numbers weren't adding up. 47 head missing from the combined tally, and no one could explain where they'd gone. The ranchers argued. Vernon insisted his count was correct. Holbrook accused him of incompetence. Others suggested the cattle had been stolen, that someone was lying about their numbers, that the whole drive should be delayed until the discrepancy was resolved. Clara walked away from the argument and toward the edge of the gathered herd. She moved slowly, watching the cattle, reading the ground the way her father had taught her. Tracks, droppings, the subtle signs that most men overlooked because they were too busy talking to notice. 10 minutes later, she found what she was looking for. Mr. Mercer. Josiah turned from the group, his expression tight with frustration. Mrs. Holt? There's a break in your north fence line. Recent, probably happened during a gathering yesterday. 47 head slipped through during the night. They followed the creek bed toward the eastern ridge. The arguing stopped. Every man present turned to stare at her. How do you know this? Holbrook demanded. Because I can read tracks, Mr. Holbrook. Something apparently not everyone here is capable of. She turned to Josiah. I know where they are. I can have them back within 3 hours if you'll lend me 2 riders to help with the drive. The silence stretched. Clara could feel the skepticism radiating from the assembled ranchers, could see the doubt on Vernon's face, could sense the tension building toward the kind of confrontation she'd spent her whole life trying to avoid. Then Josiah nodded. Vernon, take Miller and Dawson. Go with Mrs. Holt. Sir, you. Now, Vernon. The foreman's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. 20 minutes later, Clara was leading 3 men toward the eastern ridge, following tracks that none of them had noticed. She found the cattle exactly where she'd predicted, 47 head scattered but unharmed, grazing in a shallow valley 2 miles from the main gathering. With Vernon and the others flanking, she drove them back toward Mercer land, using the same techniques her father had perfected decades ago. They reached the gathering grounds before noon. The count came out perfect. That night, after the other ranchers had departed for their own spreads, Josiah found Clara by the corral. She was checking Nell's hooves, more for something to do with her hands than because it needed doing. You showed them all up today, he said quietly. Every man at that drive. Clara didn't look up. I found your cattle, that's all.
The men wanted to split up, search randomly, cover as much ground as possible. Your way recovered all 47 in 3 hours. The land tells you where they are, you said. You just have to know how to ask. Clara set down Nell's hoof and straightened. Josiah was standing closer than she'd expected, close enough that she could see the way the evening light caught the gray in his hair, the lines around his eyes, the expression on his face that she couldn't quite read.
Something dangerous stirred in her chest. Something she thought was dead forever. I should go, she said, her voice rougher than she'd intended. It's late. She mounted Nell and rode away without looking back. But she could feel his eyes on her the whole way home. Clara spent the next week trying to convince herself she wasn't falling in love with Josiah Mercer. It was ridiculous. She was 34 years old, a widow. A woman who'd buried a husband and a child and learned to live with grief the way other people lived with a bad knee or a weak heart. Always there, always aching, but manageable if you didn't think about it too much. She didn't have room in her life for this. Didn't have the strength. Didn't have the courage to open her heart again when she knew, from bitter experience, how much it hurt to lose. So she stopped visiting the ranch, stopped checking the drift-prone pastures, stopped finding reasons to ride toward Mercer Land. She went back to her empty cabin and her mechanical existence and the silence that had become her only companion. 3 days later, Josiah appeared at her door. Not about cattle this time. He carried a book under his arm, leather-bound, well-worn, the kind of book that had been read and loved rather than displayed. "My daughter left this behind when she moved," he said. "Middlemarch. George Eliot. You mentioned admiring it when you saw it at the ranch house." Claire took the book, her throat tight. "I couldn't. Dash, yo, all. It's been sitting on a shelf for 7 months. Someone should be reading it." He stood on her porch, hat in hands, with an expression that reminded her painfully of herself. Uncertain, vulnerable, desperate for connection but terrified of reaching for it. "Would you?" She hesitated. "Would you like to sit? I could make coffee. I'd like that." They sat on her porch as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Josiah talked about Emily, how proud he was of her. How strange it was to have raised someone for 17 years and then suddenly be alone. His voice was quiet, careful, as if he were testing each word before releasing it. Clara listened, and somewhere in the listening, something broke open inside her. "Thomas." Josiah stopped mid-sentence. "I'm sorry. My son." His name was Thomas. The words came out before she could stop them, before the familiar grief could clamp down and choke them back. He was 3 years old when the fever took him. "I haven't," she swallowed. "I haven't said his name out loud in 5 years." The silence stretched between them. Clara waited for the awkwardness, the discomfort, the moment when Josiah would make his excuses and leave. Instead, he reached across the space between their chairs and covered her hand with his. He didn't speak, didn't offer empty condolences or useless platitudes. Just sat there, his rough hand warm on hers, sharing the weight of a grief he understood because he'd carried his own version of it for 17 years. When the sun finally disappeared behind the mountains, neither of them moved to light a lamp. The days that followed were among the best Clara had known since before the fever took her family. She and Josiah fell into an easy rhythm. Not quite courtship, not quite friendship, something in between that defied easy definition. He came to her homestead in the evenings after his work was done. She rode to his ranch when she had tracking reports or observations about his cattle. They talked about land and livestock, about books and weather, about everything except the growing connection between them. It couldn't last. Clara knew that. Nothing good ever did, in her experience. But for a few brief weeks, she allowed herself to hope, to imagine a future that contained something other than loneliness and grief. The blow came from a direction she hadn't expected. Vernon caught Josiah in the barn on a morning when Clara had planned to bring news about a section of fence that needed mending. She arrived just in time to hear voices raised in argument, Vernon's harsh and insistent, Josiah's low and defensive. She stopped outside the barn door, uncertain whether to enter or leave.
"You're spending every spare hour with that woman." Vernon's voice carried clearly through the wooden walls. "The men are talking, Josiah. I'm talking. What does she want from you? Clara has been helpful. -EOL. Helpful?" Vernon's laugh was harsh. "A widow with nothing to her name, and suddenly she's indispensable? She shows up out of nowhere, saves your cattle, and now you're practically courting her? Can't you see what she's after? You're out of line. I'm protecting you. I've worked this ranch for 15 years. I've seen men like you, lonely, grieving, vulnerable. And I've seen women who know exactly how to take advantage of that. She wants this ranch, Josiah. She wants what you've built. That's all any of them ever want. The silence that followed was worse than the argument. Clara could feel it pressing against her, could feel the weight of Vernon's accusations settling onto her shoulders.
She should have walked away, should have climbed on Nell and ridden home without looking back. But some masochistic part of her needed to know, needed to hear what Josiah would say. Maybe you're right. His voice was quiet now, tired. Maybe I've been foolish. Clara felt something crack inside her chest, something that had only just begun to heal. She backed away from the barn door, moving as silently as she could, mounted Nell, rode home without once looking back. The next time she saw Josiah, everything had changed. He came to her homestead 2 days later, his face carefully neutral, his posture stiff. He thanked her formally for all her help with the cattle, explained that his men could handle things from here, apologized if he'd taken too much of her time. Clara stood on her porch and listened to every word, and felt the last fragile hope in her chest shatter into pieces. "I understand," she said when he finished. Her voice was steady. She'd had practice at this, hiding pain, presenting a calm surface while everything beneath it screamed. "You've been very helpful, EOL. You don't need to explain, Mr. Mercer." She met his eyes directly. "I know when I'm being dismissed." Something flickered in his expression. Guilt, maybe, or regret. But he didn't argue. Didn't explain. Didn't reach for her the way he had on those evenings when they'd sat together watching the sun go down. He just nodded once, mounted his horse, and rode away. Clara went inside and sat in the chair by her cold fireplace. She didn't cry. She was too tired to cry. She just sat in the silence and wondered why she'd ever allowed herself to hope. The week that followed was the worst Clara had known since the fever took her family. She woke each morning, performed the tasks necessary to keep herself alive, and went to bed each night feeling nothing but empty. Her garden went untended. Her animals were fed but not cared for. The book Josiah had given her, Middlemarch, with its worn cover and well-loved pages, sat on her table untouched. She began to think about selling the homestead. 40 acres wasn't worth much, maybe $350, $400 if she found the right buyer. But it would be enough to start over somewhere else. Somewhere no one knew her name. Somewhere she wouldn't have to see Josiah Mercer's ranch every time she looked north. Somewhere the silence wouldn't hurt quite so much. One evening, as the light was failing and the chill was settling into her bones, she found herself opening the drawer beside her bed. Inside, wrapped in a piece of her wedding dress, was a small wooden horse, carved from pine by her husband's patient hands, during a last winter before the fever came. Thomas had loved that horse, had carried it everywhere, slept with it tucked under his chin, named it Thunder despite its tiny size. Clara held it now, feeling the smooth wood against her palm, and finally allowed herself to weep. Not just for Thomas, not just for her husband, but for herself, for the woman she'd been before grief hollowed her out, for the hope she'd almost allowed herself to feel, for the future she'd briefly glimpsed before it was snatched away. She cried until she had nothing left. Then she sat in the dark, holding Thunder, and waited for morning to come. The knock at her door came just after sunset. Clara didn't move from her chair. She wasn't expecting anyone, wasn't any condition to receive visitors. The knock came again, more insistent this time. With a sigh that felt like it came from somewhere far deeper than her lungs, Clara rose and went to the door. Vernon Briggs stood on her porch, hat in hands, looking more uncomfortable than she'd ever seen him. "Mrs. Holt." Clara stared at him. Of all the people she might have expected, Josiah's foreman was not among them. "What do you want?" "I need to show you something." His voice was gruff, awkward. "Something I found. May I come in?" Every instinct told her to refuse. This man had poisoned Josiah against her. had spoken words that had destroyed something precious before it could fully form. She owed him nothing, less than nothing. But there was something in his expression, not hostility, not suspicion. Something that looked almost like shame. 5 minutes, she said, and stepped aside.
He entered her cabin with the careful movements of a man who knew he wasn't welcome. His eyes swept the space, taking in the cold fireplace, the untouched book on the table, the general air of neglect that had settled over everything. "I've been going through the ranch archives," he said. "Old documents, ledgers, journals, things that were bought with the land when Josiah purchased it 12 years ago." He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather-bound book, worn with age and use. "This belonged to William Holt," he said. "Your father."
Clara's breath caught. She hadn't seen that journal in over a decade, hadn't even known it still existed. After her father's death, after the land was sold, she'd assumed everything had been lost. Vernon handed it to her. "I've been reading it. The tracking methods he describes, they're exactly what you've been teaching Josiah. Every technique, every observation, every prediction about where cattle will go in bad weather." Clara opened the journal with trembling hands. Her father's handwriting filled the pages, familiar and painful at once.
"Your father was William Holt," Vernon continued. "He taught half the ranchers in this territory, including my own father, 26 years ago." He paused, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he didn't want to release. "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Holt. I thought you wanted something from Josiah. His money, his ranch. But I've been reading your father's words, and I've been watching how you handle cattle, and I've been thinking about everything you've done since you showed up at our door with those 23 head."
Clara said nothing. She wasn't sure she could speak even if she wanted to. "You don't want his ranch," Vernon said quietly. "You don't want his money, I think. I think you just want it to matter to someone again. And I think Josiah needs the same thing." He straightened, his expression settling into something like determination. "I said some things to him. Things that made him pull away from you. I'm going to tell him the truth about what I said. And then I'm going to tell him he's a fool if he lets you go."
He turned toward the door, then paused. "Your father would be proud of you, Mrs. Holt, of what you know, of how you use it." Then he was gone, leaving Clara standing in her cabin with her father's journal in her hands and something that felt terrifyingly like hope stirring once again in her chest. 2 days later, Vernon presented his evidence to Josiah. Clara wasn't there to hear it, but she could imagine the scene. Vernon laying out the journal, the tracking records, the undeniable proof of everything she'd done for the Mercer Ranch. The numbers that couldn't be argued with: 40 head lost to drift every season before Clara started helping. 0 losses since. 127 cattle recovered across 6 separate storms. Nearly $4,000 worth of livestock saved. And she'd never asked for a single dollar.
She was in her cabin that evening, trying to read by lamplight when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Her heart began to pound before she even reached the window. She knew those hoofbeats, had learned them without meaning to over weeks of visits and conversations and evenings spent watching the sun go down. By the time she opened her door, Josiah Mercer was already dismounting.
He stood in her yard, hat in hands, looking up at her with an expression that made her chest ache. He looked exhausted, uncertain, and underneath all of that, something that might have been hope. Clara. It was the first time he used her given name without the Mrs. in front of it. "Josiah. Vernon told me." He took a step closer. "What he said to me. How I reacted. I owe you an explanation." "You don't owe me anything." "I do." Another step. "I owe you more than I know how to express." He stopped at the base of her porch steps, close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the pain that still lived beneath his carefully composed expression. "I made a mistake," he said. "When Vernon spoke to me, I listened. Not because I believed him, not really, but because I was afraid." Clara waited, 17 years I raised Emily alone. I told myself I didn't need anyone else. Built my whole life around that belief. And then she left, and suddenly I was alone in a way I'd never been before. I didn't know how to handle it. He looked down at his hands, rough and scarred from decades of ranch work. You came along, and you were. He shook his head. You were unlike anyone I'd ever met. You didn't want anything from me. You just helped because you could, because you knew how. And that scared me more than anything had scared me in years. Why? Clara's voice came out rougher than she'd intended. Because I didn't know what to do with kindness that wanted nothing in return. Josiah looked up at her. Everyone wants something, Clara. That's what I believed. What I'd learned from years of disappointment and betrayal. But you didn't, and I couldn't understand it, couldn't trust it. He reached into his coat and withdrew something small. Clara couldn't see what it was in the fading light. May I come up there? Clara nodded. Her throat was too tight for words. Josiah climbed the porch steps and stalked in front of her. In his hand was a wooden horse, small and carefully carved, worn smooth by years of handling. My wife made this, he said quietly. For the son we were supposed to have. The one who didn't survive her. Clara's breath caught. I've carried it for 17 years. In my coat pocket, against my heart. A reminder of everything I lost. Everything I was afraid to lose again. He held it out to her. I'm not giving you this because I think it replaces what you lost. I know it doesn't. Nothing could. His voice cracked slightly. I'm giving it to you because I want you to know that I see you, Clara. I see your grief. I see your courage. I see how hard you've worked to keep living when everything in you wanted to stop.
Clara's vision blurred. She hadn't cried since that night with Thunder, but now the tears came without permission. I don't want you to carry your grief alone anymore, Josiah continued. And I don't want to carry mine alone either. We both lost so much, but maybe together we could find something new. Clara took the wooden horse. It was warm from being held against his chest, smooth from 17 years of love and loss and remembrance. I see you too, she whispered. I think I saw you the first day. I just didn't know what to do about it. Josiah reached out and gently brushed a tear from her cheek. His hand was rough, calloused from decades of work, but his touch was impossibly gentle. Vernon says I'm a fool if I let you go. A faint smile tugged at his lips. I'm inclined to agree with him. Clara let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Vernon said that? He did. Turns out even stubborn old foremen can learn new things. They stood there on her porch, in the fading light, with years of grief and hope and fear swirling between them. Clara felt something shifting inside her, not the end of sorrow, but the beginning of something else. Something she thought she'd never feel again. I have something for you too, she said softly. She went inside and retrieved Thunder from beside her bed. When she returned to the porch, she held out the small wooden horse, the one her husband had carved, the one Thomas had loved, the one she'd clung to in her darkest moments. His name was Thunder, she said. Thomas named him. He was only 3, but he insisted every horse should have a proper name.
Josiah took the small carving with the same reverence she'd shown his. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Clara reached out and covered his hand with hers. Their fingers intertwined, 2 wooden horses held between them, testaments to the children they'd lost, the grief they'd carried, the love that had somehow survived it all. Stay, Clara said. Please, just stay. Josiah nodded. No words necessary. They went inside together, and for the first time in 5 years, Clara's cabin didn't feel empty.
3 weeks later, Clara stood in the north pasture of the Mercer Ranch, teaching a young hand named Daniel the tracking methods her father had perfected over 22 years. The land tells you everything if you know how to listen, she said. pointing toward a shallow draw where cattle like to shelter. My father taught me that right here on this very ridge. Now I'm teaching you. That's how knowledge survives.
Daniel nodded, scribbling notes in the small leather journal Josiah had given him. He was 19, eager to learn, and reminded Clara painfully of herself at that age, hungry for knowledge, desperate to understand the land that sustained them all. "What about when the water patterns change?" he asked. "After a dry summer, the cattle won't have the same options." "Good question." Clara smiled, pleased by his insight. "That's when you start reading the secondary signs: grass patterns, shade coverage, natural wind breaks. My father kept records of drought years for exactly that reason. I'll show you his journals when we get back to the ranch house." "Your father's journals are there?" "Mr. Mercer keeps them in the archives. They belong to the land as much as to any person." She paused, feeling the weight of those words settle over her. "Knowledge isn't something you own. It's something you pass along."
They worked for another hour, walking the pasture's edges while Clara pointed out the subtle signs that most people missed. When they finally headed back toward the ranch house, the sun was low in the sky and the evening light had turned everything gold. Vernon was waiting for them at the corral. He stood by the fence, arms resting on the top rail, watching their approach with an expression Clara still wasn't entirely used to, respectful, almost friendly. He removed his hat as they drew near, a gesture of courtesy she'd never expected from him.
"Mrs. Holt, Daniel, Mr. Briggs." I wanted to say something. He shifted his weight. Clearly uncomfortable was what was coming. "I've been working this ranch for 15 years. Thought I knew everything worth knowing about cattle and land, and how to run things right." He paused, working his jaw. "I was wrong about a lot of things, but especially about you." Clara said nothing. She'd learned that sometimes the best thing you could do was let a person find their own words. "You've got more cattle sense than any hand I've ever worked with," Vernon continued. "More heart than most people I've met in 45 years of living." "And I?" He swallowed. "I'm glad you're staying." Clara felt something loosen in her chest. "Thank you, Vernon. That means more than you know." He nodded once, gruffly, then turned and walked away before the moment could get any more uncomfortable. Clara watched him go with a faint smile. "He's not so bad once you get past the stubbornness," Daniel offered. "No," Clara agreed. "I suppose he isn't."
Evening found Clara at her homestead, though it no longer felt quite so much like hers alone. Josiah's boots sat by the door. Coffee brewed on the stove. A fire burned bright in the hearth, filling the small cabin with warmth and light. On the mantel, 2 wooden horses stood side by side, Thunder and the one Josiah had carried against his heart for 17 years. Clara sat in her chair by the fire, the Book of Middlemarch open in her lap but largely unread. She was watching Josiah instead as he sat in the second chair, the one he'd built himself over 3 weekends, working with patient hands until it matched hers exactly. "You're staring," he said without looking up from his own reading. "I'm admiring the craftsmanship." "Mm-hmm." A smile tugged at his lips. "The chair, or the man who built it?" "Both." Clara closed her book. "Though the chair can't cook, which gives you a slight edge."
Josiah laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, the kind of sound that had become more frequent in the weeks since they'd found their way back to each other. He set down his book and met her eyes. "I've been thinking," he said, about what you said that first night. When you came inside and I gave you the horse." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You said you spent 5 years believing you had nothing left to give." Clara nodded slowly. The memory still carried weight, even now. "I want you to know something." Josiah leaned forward, his expression serious. "Returning my cattle, that wasn't nothing. Tracking them through storms, keeping them safe. Teaching my men how to do what you do so easily. That wasn't nothing either." "Josiah, Dasher, let me finish." He reached out and took her hand. "What you gave me wasn't cattle. It wasn't knowledge, though you gave me plenty of that too. What you gave me was the reminder that kindness still exists, that people can help each other without wanting something in return, that even after everything, the losses, the lonelies, the years of going through the motions, there's still goodness in the world.
Clara's throat tightened. She squeezed his hand but couldn't speak. You returned my cattle, Josiah said softly, but somehow, in the process, you returned me to myself. Clara thought about the woman she'd been 5 years ago, broken by grief, hollowed out by loss, convinced she would never feel anything again. She thought about the woman she was now, still scarred, still carrying her sorrow, but no longer defined by it. I spent so long believing I had nothing left to give, she said finally, that everything good in me had died with Thomas and my husband. But returning your cattle, it opened something. It reminded me that I still knew how to help, how to matter, how to be useful to someone other than myself. She looked at the wooden horses on the mantel, standing side by side in the firelight. You gave me purpose again, she continued, and in return, I found something I thought I'd lost forever. What's that? Clara smiled through the tears that had begun to gather in her eyes. The belief that my heart still had room to love.
Josiah rose from his chair and crossed the small space between them. He knelt beside her, taking both her hands in his, looking up at her with an expression that held all the tenderness she'd ever hoped to find. I want to build a life with you, he said, not to replace what either of us lost. I know that's not possible, but to create something new, something that honors what came before while reaching toward what comes next. Clara freed one hand and touched his face, the rough stubble, the weathered skin, the man who had somehow become essential to her in just a few short months. Yes, she said simply. No other words were needed.
Summer came to the Wyoming Territory with long days and warm evenings, painting the land in shades of green and gold. Clara split her time between her homestead and the Mercer Ranch, learning the rhythms of both places, finding her way into a new life that felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. She continued teaching Daniel and the other hands, passing along her father's knowledge to a new generation of cattlemen. She helped Josiah plan for the autumn drive, marking maps and predicting drift patterns with an accuracy that had become legendary among the neighboring ranchers. And she loved, not in the wild, desperate way of her youth, when she'd first married and couldn't imagine ever loving anyone else. This was different, quieter, steadier, built on a foundation of shared grief and mutual understanding. They'd both lost so much. They both knew how precious life was, how quickly it could be taken. Maybe that was why they didn't waste time on pretense or games. They said what they meant. They held each other when the old sorrows surfaced. They built something real, one day at a time. One evening in early June, Clara sat on her porch watching the sun paint the sky in brilliant colors. Josiah was beside her, his hand resting comfortably on hers, both of them content with the silence that no longer felt empty. I've been thinking, she said, about this cabin, about your ranch house, about where we're going to live when... She trailed off, suddenly shy.
Josiah turned to look at her. When what? When we're married. The words hung in the air between them. Clara felt her cheeks flush. She hadn't meant to say it quite so directly, hadn't planned to bring up the subject at all tonight. But Josiah was smiling. Is that a proposal, Mrs. Holt? No, I just meant. Because if it is, he continued, the answer is yes. Clara stared at him. Yes? Yes? He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. I was going to ask you myself, but you beat me to it. Story of our whole relationship, really. You always seem to be one step ahead. Clara laughed, the sound bubbling up from somewhere deep inside her, a place she'd thought was dead, but which had apparently only been sleeping. I didn't ask you anything. I was just thinking out loud. Too late. I've already said yes. Josiah's eyes sparkled with amusement. You're stuck with me now, Clara Holt. Though I suppose soon it'll be Clara Mercer.
Clara looked at him, this man who had somehow become her whole world, who had helped her remember what it meant to hope, and felt a joy so profound it almost hurt. Clara Mercer, she repeated softly. That sounds right. Good. Josiah rose and pulled her to her feet, wrapping his arms around her. Because I'm not letting you go. Not ever again. They stood there on the porch, holding each other, watching the sun disappear behind the mountains as the first stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. The wedding took place in late summer, on a ridge overlooking both their properties. Just a small gathering, the hands from Josiah's ranch, a few neighbors who'd watched their unlikely courtship unfold, and Vernon, who stood beside Josiah as something like a best man. Clara wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her own frame. Josiah wore a suit he'd had made for Emily's wedding, dusted off and pressed for the occasion. Neither of them cared about the ceremony itself. They'd already made their vows to each other in 100 small ways over the preceding months. But there was something sacred about speaking the words aloud, about making promises in front of witnesses, about declaring publicly what they'd come to know privately, that they belonged together. After the ceremony, after the simple meal and the awkward toasts and the well wishes of neighbors who'd once whispered about Clara's visits to the Mercer Ranch, they returned to what was now their shared home, Josiah's ranch house, spacious enough for two people who'd each spent too long living alone. Clara's cabin remained, a short ride away, kept maintained for memory's sake. Her father's land, her first home with her husband and son, she couldn't bring herself to sell it, and Josiah never asked her to. That first night as husband and wife, they sat together in the main room of the ranch house, surrounded by the life Josiah had built and the love they were building together. On the mantel above the fireplace, 3 wooden horses now stood side by side thunder, the one Josiah had carried and a third that Clara had carved herself over the long summer evenings. This one was slightly rough, clearly the work of an amateur, but she'd made it with her own hands. What did you name it? Josiah asked, noticing where her gaze had fallen. Hope, Clara said quietly. I named it Hope.
Josiah pulled her close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. That's perfect. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn low, feeling the peace of a house that was finally, truly full.
Clara thought about the woman who'd shown up on Josiah's porch all those months ago, mud-caked and exhausted, with nothing to offer but news about some stray cattle. She'd been so empty then, so certain that her life would never contain anything but grief and loneliness. She'd been wrong. She'd returned his lost cattle, and in the process, she'd found her way home. Autumn came with its usual demands, cattle drives, preparations for winter, the endless cycle of ranch work that never truly ended. Clara threw herself into it gladly, discovering muscles she'd forgotten she had and skills she'd never known she possessed. She worked alongside Josiah and Vernon and the hands, no longer an outsider but an integral part of the operation. The men who'd once questioned her presence now came to her with questions, seeking her knowledge, respecting her judgment. Even Holbrook, the rancher who'd mocked her at the spring drive, had begun treating her differently, not quite with deference, but with something approaching professional regard. Mrs. Crawford still whispered, of course. Some things never changed. But the whispers had shifted from scandal to grudging admiration. Can you believe it? The widow Holt running cattle like a man? And Clara found she no longer cared what the town gossips thought. She had Josiah. She had purpose. She had a future. What more could she ask for? Winter arrived early that year, bringing the kind of cold that settled into bones and refused to leave. Clara spent her days making sure the hands were prepared, checking supply stores, ensuring that every drift-prone pasture was properly monitored. She'd become essential to the operation, as integral to the Mercer Ranch as Vernon himself. The men respected her. The cattle seemed to respond to her presence, and Josiah looked at her sometimes with an expression that still made her heart skip. even after all these months. One evening in late November, they sat together in the ranch house, the fire burning high against the chill outside. Clara was mending a shirt while Josiah reviewed the season's accounts, their companionable silence broken only by the crackle of flames and the scratch of his pen. "I've been thinking," Josiah said suddenly. Clara looked up from her needle. About? About next spring. About expanding the operation. He set down his pen and met her eyes. About what we might do with an extra pair of hands. Clara's needle paused mid-stitch. An extra pair of hands? Josiah's expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the hope flickering beneath it. "I know we've never discussed. I know you had Thomas, and losing him. I would never ask you to." He trailed off, uncertain, and Clara felt her heart swell with love for this man who tried so hard to be gentle with her grief. "You're asking if I want children," she said softly.
I'm asking if you'd want to consider it. Someday. When you're ready. If you're ever ready. He reached across and took her hand. I love you, Clara. Our life together is more than enough for me. I don't need anything more than what we have. But you want it. I. He hesitated. I would like it. Yes, but not if it causes you pain. Not if it brings back memories that are too hard to bear.
Clara thought about Thomas. About his laugh, his curiosity, the way he'd clutched thunder against his chest and demanded bedtime stories, even when he could barely keep his eyes open. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it had changed over the months since she'd found Josiah. It was no longer a wound that bled. It was a scar that ached, but didn't prevent her from living. "I don't know if I'm ready," she said honestly, "but I think I might want to be." Josiah's face softened. "That's enough. That's more than enough." He pulled her into his arms, and they held each other while the fire burned low and the winter wind howled outside. They didn't need to solve everything tonight. They had time. They had each other. They had hope. Spring came late that year, but when it arrived, it came with a vengeance, melting snow, rushing creeks, and the kind of vibrant green that made the whole territory look newborn. Clara stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching the dawn break over the eastern hills. In the pastures below, cattle grazed peacefully, their numbers intact despite another harsh winter. 0 losses thanks to the systems she and Josiah had put in place. 0 cattle wandering alone in box canyons, waiting for someone to find them. Behind her, the door opened and Josiah joined her on the porch. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Beautiful morning," he murmured. "It is." They stood together in silence, watching the light spread across the land they'd both come to love. "I've been thinking," Clara said. "About what?" She turned in his arms, looking up at his face, the face she'd come to know better than her own, with its lines and weathering and unexpected gentleness. "About that extra pair of hands you mentioned last winter?" Josiah's eyes widened slightly. "Clara, I'm not saying yes. Not yet, but I'm not saying no either." She reached up and touched his face. "I think I might be ready to hope for it." His smile was like the sunrise, slow, inevitable, and achingly beautiful. "That's enough," he said softly. "That's more than enough." The end of Clara's story, her real ending, not the tragedy she'd once thought was inevitable, came not with a single moment, but with 1,000 small ones, accumulated over months and years like interest in a bank. It came with autumn drives and winter preparations, with tracking cattle through storms and teaching young hands the ways of the land. It came with quiet evenings by the fire and loud mornings in the chaos of ranch life. It came with grief that never fully faded and joy that never stopped surprising her. It came, most of all, with the man who had looked at her that first morning and seen something worth keeping. The man who had opened his door to a stranger with mud on her boots and cattle in her barn, and ended up giving her back everything she thought she'd lost. Clara had returned his lost cattle, all those months ago. 23 head, then 47 more, then 127 across a half dozen storms. She'd done it because she knew how, because the land told her everything as she listened, because some knowledge was too precious to waste. But in the end, the cattle weren't the point. They'd just been the door. The point was this: two people, broken by grief, had found their way to each other through an act of simple kindness. They'd built something new from the wreckage of their old lives. They discovered that the heart, no matter how damaged, still had room to grow. Clara stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that defied description. Josiah was beside her, his hand warm in hers, their lives intertwined in ways neither of them could have predicted. On the mantel inside, 3 wooden horses stood watch over a home that was finally, truly full. She had returned his lost cattle. He had returned something she'd lost long ago, the belief that her heart still had room to love. And in the end, that had made all the difference. The end.